Mary Whitlock stepped off the train as though the ground beneath her feet had shifted into another world. The iron wheels clattered away into the distance, leaving behind a smoke that clung to her shawl like the memory of another life. She drew the fabric close around her shoulders, though the air was not yet cold. It was the eyes upon her that chilled her, the kind that measured, judged, and dismissed before she had spoken a word. The small frontier station lay bare beneath the glare of late sun, its boards creaking under boots, its air filled with dust and coal. She carried a small carpetbag, worn at the seams, its weight far less than the burden she carried within her. For days she had imagined this moment would be different, a man waiting, perhaps even a smile offered, perhaps a wagon to carry her forward into a new life. She had stitched hope into every thought during that long journey, pressing her hand to her belly as if she could quiet the worry growing there. But the platform held only faces of strangers, faces that offered no welcome. Then one figure pushed forward, the man who had written her the letters. His shoulders were wide beneath a vest gone shiny at the edges, and his face was red from whiskey or sun, she could not tell. His eyes, narrow and sharp, went straight to her middle, not her face. In that moment, Mary knew. "You never said," he muttered, his voice loud enough for all around to hear. "Never said a word about being already with child." Mary held her bag tighter. "I told the agency what I could. My husband is gone. The child is his. I only asked for a chance." He spat into the dust at her feet. "A chance? A man doesn't send for a woman heavy with another man's seed. I won't have it." His hand slipped into his vest, came out with coins, and he tossed them at her. They clinked against the boards, rolling crookedly before coming to rest against her boot. "Take the train back east. Or find some fool here who'll pity you. It won't be me." The boards of the platform went quiet beneath the hush that followed. A boy leaned on a post, straw dangling from his mouth, eyes wide with delight at the scene. An old woman muttered something about shame and turned away. Others stood silent, the kind of silence that lets cruelty do its work unchecked. Mary bent slowly, gathering the coins into her palm. The feel of the metal burned against her skin, not from heat but from humiliation. She would not cry, not here, not before them. Pride stitched her backbone straighter than any corset. She lifted her chin, though the weight in her belly pulled her down. The shawl slipped from her shoulder, and she drew it back up with a quick motion, as though covering not just her body but her dignity. She thought of her late husband, a gambler who had carried more promises than he ever kept. His death had come sudden, leaving nothing but debts and this swelling life inside her. She had believed, foolishly perhaps, that another man's promise might offer reprieve. That belief now lay scattered in the dust with the coins. At the far end of the platform stood another man, one who had not spoken. Daniel Reeves leaned against a post, his hat brim low, a scar tracing the line of his cheek. His presence was quiet, almost part of the wood and dust, but his eyes did not leave her. He saw how she steadied herself, how she held her breath against the weight of ridicule, how she gathered the fragments of dignity others tried to break. He did not step forward. Words would have been useless against such cruelty, he knew. But he noted the steel beneath her silence, and he carried it in his heart. The departing train wailed, a long cry that stretched thin across the land, like sorrow refusing to die. Mary turned her head, watching the smoke drift across the horizon until it vanished. That train had been her lifeline. Its disappearance sealed her exile. There would be no journey back, no place waiting east of here. Only rejection awaited there. She was anchored now to this dust, for better or worse. The man who had rejected her cursed beneath his breath and strode away, his boots heavy on the boards. The crowd, satisfied the spectacle had ended, drifted back to their own business. The boy spat out his straw, the old woman disappeared behind the station door, and within minutes it was as though nothing had happened at all. Nothing, except for Mary, alone, shawl pulled tight, carpetbag at her feet, coins locked in her fist. The wind shifted, carrying with it the dry smell of sage and horse sweat. She closed her eyes and breathed once, long and deep. When she opened them again, the station was emptier, but the silence was fuller, heavy enough to press against her ribs. Daniel Reeves had not moved. He lingered at the edge, scar catching the dying light, hands folded across his chest. He had fought wars and buried the only woman he ever loved beneath cottonwoods, her braided hair still vivid in memory each night he sat by the fire. He knew loss. He knew silence. And he knew that sometimes strength was not in the shouting, but in the refusal to bow. He thought of speaking, one word, perhaps, but the word never came. Nothing he could say would return her promise of a home, nor ease the shame these townsfolk had cut into her. So he remained still, letting her keep the dignity she had fought to hold. Yet as the sun lowered, he felt something stir, an old ache, the sense of a road opening where he had thought all roads were closed. Mary looked once toward the horizon, then down at her child's hidden weight. The shawl gathered around her shoulders, dark with dust but steadfast. She would not fall here. If she must walk into the wilderness alone, then she would. For herself, for the child, for the sliver of mercy she still believed might be found somewhere in this hard land. The platform boards creaked as she shifted her bag, the sound echoing like footsteps in an empty hall. Alone, she stood against the dying sun. And from the shadowed edge, Daniel Reeves carried her image with him into the gathering dusk. The road from the station stretched out in silence, broken only by the creak of wagon wheels and the groan of wood settling against harness straps. Daniel Reeves held the reins loose in his hands, guiding the bay mare with an easy patience. Beside him, Mary Whitlock sat stiffly, her small bag pressed against her knees, shawl wrapped tight though the evening carried little chill. The coins the man had thrown at her still burned in her pocket, though she had no intention of using them. She had refused his offer at first. "I can walk," she had said, voice steady, though her legs trembled. But Daniel had not asked a second time. He had simply waited, hat brim shadowing his eyes, until her pride bent beneath the weight of practicality. Now she sat in the wagon, the smell of leather and horse sweat around her, the road dust curling up in small clouds that clung to her hem. Neither spoke. The silence between them was not hostile but heavy, filled with words unsaid. Mary's hands rested against her middle, as though shielding the child from judgment that had already marked it. She stared ahead, the horizon burning gold, then deepening into rose as the sun lowered. Daniel kept his gaze fixed on the road, on the familiar shapes of land he had crossed 100 times, though tonight they seemed changed by the presence of the stranger at his side. By the time the ranch came into view, the sky had shifted into twilight, a bruised purple streaked with fading light. The house stood plain and sturdy against the rolling hills, logs weathered gray, roof patched more than once. A barn leaned slightly from years of wind, but the fences stood tight, rails mended, gates firm. Daniel brought the wagon to a halt, set the brake, and climbed down. He offered no hand to help her, though he slowed his steps so she might descend without haste. Inside, the house smelled faintly of pine resin and ashes. The hearth lay cold, but wood was stacked neatly by the side. A cedar rocking chair stood near the window, draped with a shawl that had not been touched in years. Mary's eyes lingered on it, though she said nothing. She could feel the ghost of another woman in the room, quiet but present, woven into the walls and floorboards. Daniel lit a lamp, its glow throwing long shadows across the rough-hewn beams. His movements were deliberate, almost ritual. The tools by the door were arranged in perfect order, hammer beside nails, spade beside axe. The rifles that might have been displayed as trophies in another man's home were instead cleaned and stored away, barrels oiled, stocks polished, but never flaunted. It was a house kept not for show but for use, each thing in its place, each scar in the wood left to tell its story without shame. Mary set her bag on the floor near the wall and pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders. She felt out of place, an intruder in a life that had already closed itself off. Daniel offered her the chair by the hearth and busied himself with the fire. Sparks caught, and soon the flames rose, flickering against his face, deepening the lines carved by war and sorrow. Night thickened around them. Coyotes called in the distance, their voices sharp, mournful, rising and falling like questions to the moon. Mary closed her eyes for a moment, and in that sound she remembered the man she had once called husband. Not the gambler who laughed too loud in saloons, nor the debtor who left her with nothing but threats at the door. She remembered the night he had not come home at all, the night men carried word of his death as though it were nothing but another bet lost. The debts had swallowed her faster than grief could. And yet grief had remained, pressing against her even as she fled east, then west, searching for a place to plant her sorrow. Across the room, Daniel sat in silence, eyes on the fire. The light played across the scar on his cheek, catching the hollows of his face. He thought of another time, another woman. He had watched her braid her hair each morning, fingers moving with practiced grace. She had hummed songs she never finished, melodies that drifted through the house like threads of sunlight. Then the storm had come, the kind that tore roofs and hearts apart. He had found her body beneath snow, her shawl tangled around her shoulders, eyes closed as though in sleep. He had buried her beneath cottonwoods, the ground hard and frozen, his heart harder still. Since then, silence had been his companion, silence and the order of tools placed carefully in their rows. Now another woman sat by his fire, shawl drawn tight, belly rounded with another man's child. He felt the stir of something old, something he had locked away, the ache of sharing space, of hearing another breath in the quiet, of knowing that sorrow was not his alone. Mary opened her eyes, sensing his gaze, though he quickly looked back to the fire. She spoke softly, her voice nearly lost to the crackle of wood. "You keep things neat." Daniel gave a slow nod. "Work goes easier that way." She waited, but no more words came. She understood. Some men filled silence with noise. Others carried silence like armor. Daniel Reeves was the latter. She respected that, even as it deepened the distance between them. The fire settled into coals, glowing red against the dark. The coyotes cried once more, then fell quiet, leaving only the whisper of wind against the logs. Mary shifted in the chair, her hand resting against her belly, and let her thoughts drift. The past sat beside her, as real as the chair she occupied, her husband's debts, the shame of rejection, the cruel eyes at the station. The past would always be there, she realized. One could not outrun it, it would sit at the table whether named or not. Daniel's thoughts moved the same path. He could offer a roof, a fire, perhaps a measure of safety. But trust? Trust had been buried with his wife. Offering shelter was one thing. Opening the door to his heart was another. He was not sure if such a door still existed. As the night deepened, they sat in silence, two lives stitched together by nothing but necessity. The firelight flickered across their faces, shadows rising and falling like the ghosts of memory. Neither spoke again before sleep, yet in that quiet something unspoken began to settle, not peace, not yet, but the faint recognition that broken lives could endure side by side. And outside, beneath the endless sky, the coyotes cried once more, their voices carrying the truth both had already realized: silence was not empty. Silence was where the past lived, and where endurance began. The storm came first as a whisper, a thin wind curling through the gaps of the shutters, rattling them like fingers drumming in warning. By nightfall it had grown into a roar. Rain lashed against the windows, each drop striking with the sound of gravel flung by unseen hands. The sky cracked open with lightning that split the plains into day and night in the same breath. Thunder rolled heavy across the valley, shaking the bones of the house until even the fire in the hearth seemed to shrink back. Mary drew her shawl close, sitting near the rocking chair while Daniel checked the shutters once more. His steps were calm, measured, though his eyes carried the memory of storms that had taken more than roofs in years past. He pushed against the wood until it held, then returned to the fire, leaning his rifle against the wall though he did not reach for it. Outside, the wind carried more than rain. There was a sound, faint, uncertain, like the stagger of unsteady feet. Mary's hand froze on the fabric of her shawl. Daniel lifted his head, listening. Another flash of lightning struck, throwing the world into stark white. In that brief glare, a figure appeared, close to the barn, bent against the storm. The shape was small, young, and moved with the lurch of the wounded. Mary's breath caught. Daniel stood, crossing to the door. He did not move quickly, but with the same steady deliberation with which he did all things. He lifted the bar, unlatched the lock, and opened the door a crack. Rain blew in at once, cold and sharp, carrying with it the smell of earth torn open. There on the step stood a youth, his hair black and long, plastered against his face with rain. His clothes clung to him, torn at the sleeve where blood ran dark. His eyes, though dulled by exhaustion, still burned with the wild defiance of one raised to distrust these walls. He was Apache, Mary could see it as plainly as Daniel did. For an instant, her heart leapt into her throat. She had heard the stories whispered in towns, of raids, of vengeance, of blood debts never forgiven. Daniel met the boy's gaze without flinching. He did not ask a question, did not raise a weapon. He only stepped aside, leaving the door open against the storm. The boy hesitated, his jaw tightening, but another peal of thunder shook the air and drove him forward. He crossed the threshold like a hunted animal, cautious and ready to flee, but too cold and too hurt to remain outside. Mary's fingers clenched around the fabric of her skirt. Fear warred with pity as she watched water drip from his hair onto the wooden floor. Daniel moved to the hearth, pouring coffee from the pot simmering near the coals. He set the cup on the table, sliding it toward the boy without a word. Then he took a piece of bread from the tin and placed it beside the cup. The boy's eyes flicked from Daniel's scarred face to the food. Slowly, he reached out, hands trembling from more than the storm, and wrapped his fingers around the cup. Steam rose, curling into the shadows. He drank, small sips at first, then larger, his shoulders relaxing with each swallow. He tore into the bread, eating quickly but not greedily, as though unsure how long this welcome might last. Mary's heart softened as she watched. Her fear did not vanish, but it bent beneath the weight of hunger and youth she saw in him. He could not have been more than 17, perhaps younger. Whatever stories the towns whispered, this boy was flesh and blood, weary and wounded. She shifted, setting another log on the fire, letting its warmth spread further into the room. Daniel said nothing. He did not demand explanation, did not seek repayment. His silence was not indifference but a choice, one Mary could sense. He lived by principles carved deeper than prejudice. The firelight caught the scar on his cheek as he sat back, watching the boy eat with quiet patience. When the storm grew harsher, shaking the roof with its fists of wind, Mary rose to fetch a dry cloth. She hesitated, then stepped close enough to hand it to the youth. For a moment their eyes met, hers uncertain, his guarded. But he accepted the cloth, pressing it against his bleeding arm. His lips moved, shaping words she could not understand, but the tone carried gratitude. She nodded once, and returned to her chair, heart still trembling but steadier than before. Hours passed with the storm. Lightning lit the room in sudden flashes, thunder shook the rafters, yet inside a fragile calm began to weave itself. The boy finished his bread, drained his cup, and sat quietly, shoulders no longer stiff with suspicion. His gaze lingered on the fire, as though it carried some memory of his own people's hearths, now distant. At last he rose. His legs wavered, but pride held him steady. He set the empty cup carefully on the table, then reached into a pouch at his belt. From it he drew a small carving, rough but shaped with care, a wooden horse, its head bowed, mane etched with deliberate strokes. He placed it on the table, pushing it gently toward Daniel. Daniel studied it for a long moment, then gave a single nod. He did not smile, but his eyes softened. Mary watched, feeling the weight of what had passed. No words were needed. The token was more than thanks, it was recognition, perhaps even trust, offered in the only way the boy could give. Without waiting for permission, the youth turned toward the door. Daniel opened it again, letting the storm sweep in. The boy stepped out, head bowed against the rain, and in another flash of lightning he was gone, swallowed by the night. Mary let out a breath she had not known she was holding. Her shawl lay loose now, her fear eased by the memory of the boy's trembling hands clutching bread and coffee. She turned her gaze to Daniel. He had closed the door, set the bar back in place, and returned to the fire. His silence was the same, yet it carried a weight she had not noticed before. It was not only silence of grief, but silence of principle, of choices made in a world where hatred came easier than mercy. In that moment she saw him differently, not as the man who had merely given her shelter, but as one whose fairness ran deeper than fear. She realized that her own heart, battered as it was, still had room to recognize pain in others. Even with her child's weight pressing heavy within her, she could not close herself off from the wounded world. The storm raged on outside, but within the house a fragile thread had been woven, thin, delicate, yet enough to bridge the silence. And both of them, sitting by the firelight, felt it. The days stretched into one another, the rhythm of ranch life steady as hoofbeats, yet Mary felt the weight of each hour as though it were judged and counted by unseen eyes. She remained at Daniel Reeves's ranch, her carpetbag tucked neatly in a corner, her shawl always about her shoulders, her hands restless with small tasks, sweeping a floor that was already clean, mending a shirt that did not need repair, folding and refolding the same cloth as though to prove her worth. But beyond the walls, whispers carried. When she ventured into town for flour or lamp oil, voices followed her steps. Some said she was ruined. Others called Daniel a fool, a man too blind to see what burden he had invited under his roof. Mary kept her chin high, though each word lodged itself inside her like a stone she could not put down. The cruelest part was not the insults flung openly but the silences, women drawing their children close, men turning away, as though shame were something that might rub off if they let her pass too near. At the ranch, Daniel said little of what he heard. Yet his silence at supper carried its own weight. They ate in the glow of the fire, the sound of spoons against bowls filling the space where conversation might have lived. Mary found herself studying the lines of his face in that flickering light, wondering at the thoughts he did not speak. He had not sent her away, not yet, but she felt the pull of strain between them, like a rope stretched too tight. One evening, while Daniel worked in the barn, Mary wandered the small house, her hands trailing across the rough-hewn furniture. She paused at the cedar rocking chair near the window. The shawl still lay draped across it, faded but soft, its folds carrying the memory of a woman's shoulders. Slowly, reverently, Mary lifted it, shook the dust from it, and folded it neatly. She placed it back across the chair, smoothing it with a tenderness that surprised even herself. When she turned, Daniel was in the doorway, his frame filling the space, his eyes fixed on the shawl. For a long breath neither spoke. The air between them felt fragile, as though words might break it. Then he gave the smallest nod, not of permission but of acknowledgement. She had not dishonored the memory. She had honored it. Something unspoken passed between them, an understanding of grief, an agreement that the dead did not vanish when the living remembered them gently. Yet the tension did not ease. Each day seemed to bring another reminder that the child she carried would never be his. Neighbors, bold enough when drink loosened their tongues, told Daniel he was a fool for keeping her. One man said plainly at the mercantile, "You'll feed another man's blood, and what will you get for it? Nothing but shame." Daniel had not answered, only set his jaw and finished his purchase. But Mary saw the heaviness in his shoulders when he returned that evening. She sensed the strain pressing on him as surely as it pressed on her. She could not bear the thought that she might be the cause of his burden. That night, when the fire burned low and shadows deepened across the room, she spoke. "I should leave at first light," she said quietly, not looking up from her hands. "I'll not bring you more trouble than I already have." The silence that followed seemed to echo louder than thunder. Daniel did not look at her at once. He stared into the fire, as though searching its coals for an answer. His face was unreadable, carved of stone and shadow. Mary felt the sting of tears pressing behind her eyes, though she fought to keep them hidden. She had known rejection before, but here, beneath this roof, she had begun to hope again. Foolishly, perhaps, but hope nonetheless. To offer to leave was to tear her own heart, but better that than wait for him to cast her out. Daniel rose without a word. He crossed the room, lifted her worn boots from beside the hearth, and carried them to the table. Sitting beneath the lamplight, he drew a small knife and a strip of leather from his pouch. His hands worked with slow precision, mending the cracked seams, patching the places where wear had split them. The knife scraped softly, the thread pulled tight, the leather bent and bound. He said nothing the whole while, yet his actions spoke louder than words could. Mary sat frozen, watching. Her chest ached with unspoken feeling. The firelight glinted on the scar across his cheek, on the careful curve of his hands as he worked. She realized then that he was answering her, just not with words. When he finished, he placed the boots by the door, polished as best as their age allowed, the stitching strong. Only then did he speak, his voice quiet, rough with restraint. "They'll hold another season yet." Mary swallowed hard, unable to speak. She understood. He would not let her walk out into the wilderness alone. That night, as the coyotes called from the hills and the wind pressed against the shutters, Mary lay awake on her cot. Her hands rested on her belly, feeling the child shift within her. She longed for a place where the child could be born without shame, where whispers would not cut like knives, where she might raise her head without fear of judgment. She did not know if this house could become such a place, but she knew one thing with certainty: Daniel Reeves was not a man to abandon the helpless. In the other room, Daniel sat by the fire long after she had gone to bed. The rocking chair creaked once as the wind touched it, the folded shawl resting across it like memory preserved. His eyes drifted from the chair to the boots at the door. He knew what the neighbors expected of him. He knew the burden of another man's child was not his to carry. And yet, he also knew he would not send her into the wild with nothing but shame and dust. The fire sank into embers, glowing softly in the dark. In that quiet, Daniel came to his own realization. Offering shelter was easier than offering trust. But sometimes, refusing to abandon someone was the first step toward something deeper. The evening settled heavy across the land, wind pushing hard against the shutters, rattling them like bones in a box. Inside, the fire burned steady, its glow painting the log walls in hues of amber and shadow. Daniel sat at the table, his chair tilted slightly back, hat resting on the shelf above him. Mary sat near the hearth, shawl draped over her shoulders, hands folded in her lap. The silence between them was not new, yet tonight it felt different, charged, as though the storm outside demanded confessions long withheld. The wind howled again, and the rocking chair creaked faintly by the window, its cedar frame shifting with memory. Daniel's eyes lingered on it, the folded shawl lying untouched across the back. His hand flexed against his thigh, a restless movement he rarely showed. Mary watched him quietly, sensing the weight pressing against him, the unspoken grief that haunted his every breath. At last Daniel leaned forward, elbows on his knees, voice low. "First snow came early that year. Harder than I'd seen in a long while. Roof groaned all night. Thought it would split." His eyes stayed fixed on the fire, not on her. "I found her at dawn. Out by the cottonwoods. She'd gone out to fetch wood before I woke. Snow took her. Froze her where she stood." His voice cracked, thin with effort. He swallowed, hard, then forced the words out. "I carried her back. Laid her here, in this room, by that fire. Couldn't feel her hand even when I held it to the flame." The fire snapped, sending a burst of sparks up the chimney. Mary's heart ached at the image, of a woman folded into snow, of a man kneeling helpless beside her. She clutched her shawl tighter, as though against a cold that was not in the room but in his memory. "I buried her there," Daniel continued, his tone stripped bare. "Cottonwoods still stand. Couldn't bring myself to cut them. Some days I sit out there just to remind myself she was real. The silence that followed was thick, pulsing like a wound. Mary felt tears prick her eyes, but she did not let them fall. Instead, she spoke softly, her words a confession long carried like a stone in her chest. My husband, he wasn't what he promised. Gambler, drinker, charmer with every woman in town. I kept hoping he'd change, but hope can blind as much as it can light the way. He left me nothing but debts. Men came to the door shouting, demanding what he owed. And then, as if he hadn't taken enough, death came and finished what ruin he started. Left me with sorrow and a belly too heavy for doors to stay open. Her hands pressed against her middle, instinctive, protective. Her voice trembled, though she forced it steady. I thought maybe someone else's promise might save me. I thought wrong. Now I carry his child, and with it, every whisper of shame the world can throw. The words fell between them, mixing with the crackle of the fire. For a long time, Daniel said nothing. His eyes remained on the flames, but his silence was different tonight, not armor, not avoidance, but a deep listening. Mary felt seen in that silence, as though her confession had not condemned her but carved a space where truth could stand without fear. The fire burned brighter as the wind rattled harder, and their shadows stretched long across the walls, 2 figures apart, yet drawn by the same light. Daniel shifted slightly, his gaze moving at last from the flames to her. He studied her face, the determination behind her eyes, the way sorrow had etched lines too early but had not broken her spirit. You carry it alone, he said simply. Mary's lips trembled. I've had no choice. He leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. You're stronger for it. Don't let their words make you think otherwise. The tenderness in his voice startled her. Not pity, not judgment, something steadier, quieter, like the coals of the fire that glowed long after flames died. Her breath hitched, and for the first time since stepping off that train, she felt she had not been measured and found wanting. The storm pressed harder against the house, shutters groaning, but within, a stillness settled. Respect, unspoken but undeniable, wove itself across the space between them. It softened the edges of tension, replaced the silence with something richer. Mary shifted, her shawl slipping slightly from her shoulder. Almost without thought, she reached to pull it tighter. Daniel's eyes followed the motion. He rose, slow and deliberate, crossed the short distance to where she sat. From the peg near the door he took his coat, a heavy wool, worn but warm, and draped it over her shoulders. The weight of it surprised her, the scent of leather and wood smoke clinging to the fabric. Her eyes lifted to meet his. His hand lingered a moment longer than necessity allowed, resting against the back of the chair rather than her, yet close enough that she could feel the presence of it. No words passed between them. None were needed. The gesture carried more than comfort. It carried acknowledgement. Mary's heart swelled with a realization that struck deep. She was not judged in his eyes. Not condemned, not diminished, but seen, truly seen, for the strength she carried, for the pain she had borne, for the endurance that kept her standing when others would have fallen. Daniel, too, felt the truth settle within him. Love, the roaring blaze he had once known, might never rise again. But perhaps love did not always roar. Perhaps it could live like this, quiet and steady, burning deep as coals in a hearth, warm enough to keep away the cold, constant enough to last the night. The fire glowed bright between them, shadows long upon the walls. Outside, the storm howled, rattling the world to its bones. Inside, 2 broken lives sat in its defiance, bound not by touch but by respect, tenderness, and the first stirrings of trust. And for the first time in years, Daniel Reeves allowed himself to believe that silence did not mean emptiness. Sometimes, silence meant beginning. The night it began, the wind was still and the sky heavy with stars. Mary woke with a sharp pain low in her belly, one that gripped her so fiercely she had to clutch the edge of the cot to keep from crying out. Another wave followed, stronger, undeniable. She whispered Daniel's name, and at once he was there, his scarred face drawn with quiet urgency, his hands steady though his eyes betrayed the storm rising within him. "It's time," she breathed, her voice shaking. He nodded once, no panic, no wasted words. He fetched water, towels, anything he had, but they both knew it would not be enough. A woman could not bring forth life alone, not without risk. She needed a doctor. And the nearest one was in town. Mary shook her head when he reached for his coat. "They'll refuse. They don't want me." Daniel cut her off with a look, stern and unyielding. "You need the doctor." That was all he said before strapping his rifle across his back and heading out into the night. The ride into town was swift, his horse's hooves drumming against hard earth like war beats. Lantern light flickered as he passed houses, windows closing quickly, doors shutting fast. Whispers followed in the dark, but Daniel did not slow. When he reached the doctor's house, he dismounted and pounded on the door with a fist that rattled its hinges. The doctor, gray-haired and weary-eyed, cracked the door, shaking his head before a word was spoken. "I've heard enough about that woman. She brought her trouble here herself." "She?" Daniel stepped forward, the rifle slung across his back catching the light. His voice, low but firm, left no room for argument. "You're coming. Now." For a long moment, the doctor hesitated, eyes narrowing at the man who stood before him like a sentinel carved of stone. Then, with a muttered curse, he gathered his bag and followed. Daniel did not thank him. He simply mounted up, the doctor behind him, and rode hard back into the dark. Inside the small ranch house, Mary labored, each cry muffled against her shawl so as not to disturb the dead woman's memory in the rocking chair nearby. The doctor worked with brisk efficiency, issuing instructions that Daniel obeyed without question. Hours stretched on, filled with pain and silence broken only by the fire's hiss and Mary's strained breaths. Daniel remained outside the room, hat in hand, pacing the worn boards of the porch. The night air bit cold, stars wheeling slowly above, but he did not feel the chill. He had not felt so powerless since the morning he found his wife frozen in the snow. That memory clung to him, heavy as iron, until at last a new sound pierced the night, a thin, fierce cry that rose above everything else. He stopped in his tracks. The sound was sharp, small, alive. His chest tightened, his throat closed, and he pressed his hat against his chest as though steadying a heart too long hollow. A child's cry. A beginning. Something he had thought forever lost. Minutes later, the doctor emerged, weary but satisfied. "She's strong. Both of them." He packed his bag without ceremony, muttering that he'd done his part, then vanished into the night, leaving behind only the echo of his boots. Daniel stepped inside. Mary lay pale and trembling, her hair damp against her temples, but in her arms rested a small bundle swaddled in cloth. The child's eyes were closed, her cries softened now into tiny breaths, her fists curled as though gripping onto life itself. Mary looked up, her voice hoarse but clear. "A daughter." Daniel stood still, staring as though the sight alone might undo him. He removed his hat, held it against his chest, and bowed his head, not in shame, not in sorrow, but in reverence. The firelight caught the edges of his scar, but his eyes glowed with something far deeper than pain. He had no words, so he gave her silence, and in that silence lay more than speech could hold. Days later, when the child's breath had grown steady and Mary regained her strength, Daniel harnessed the wagon. Mary sat inside, the infant nestled close against her chest, shawl wrapped around them both. Daniel took the reins, guiding the horses toward town. People turned as they arrived, eyes sharp with curiosity, whispers darting like shadows. Some scoffed, some sneered. Yet Daniel did not lower his gaze. He did not hide her. He rode openly down the main street, rifle across his back, face solemn as stone. His silence spoke louder than any defense, these two were under his protection. They belonged. Mary felt the weight of eyes upon her, the judgment as cruel as ever, yet she held her daughter closer and lifted her chin. For the first time since stepping off that train, she did not feel alone. The shame others tried to cast on her slid away beneath the shelter of Daniel's presence. He had not spoken the words, but his actions told the truth. This was her home now. At the end of the street, Daniel slowed the horses. He glanced once toward Mary, then to the small bundle in her arms. The faintest softness touched his face, a look that held both sorrow and something new, something like hope. In that moment Mary understood. Protection, she realized, was love in its truest form. Not promises scribbled in letters, not sweet words spoken in saloons, but the unshakable stance of a man who refused to let the world discard her. And Daniel, watching mother and child beneath the shawl's fold, felt his own revelation. Love would not roar for him again, not like it once had. But here, beside him, it burned quieter, steadier, no less true. He had thought himself hollow, yet family had found him once more, fragile, unexpected, but real. The wagon rolled on, wheels creaking steady as a heartbeat. The whispers of townfolk faded behind them. Ahead lay open land, sky wide and unbroken. Mary rested her head back, her daughter warm against her, Daniel solid beside her on the bench. Together they rode, not as strangers bound by necessity, but as something closer to a family, shaped not by blood, nor by promise, but by endurance, respect, and the quiet strength of love that did not need words to be known.